Kaminska, former FT, Politico, now doing her own thing on Blind Spot and The Peg.
Now pegging independently. Hello, and welcome to the Edition podcast. As ever, I'm Charlotte Henry, bringing you the crossover of culture, media and sport over at the Edition.net. In this weekly podcast, I'm really excited. I'm really lucky because I've got Izabella Kaminska. She was known at the FT. She was known at Politico. She's now running independent publications based around the crypto stablecoin world. You can tell us all about those. Hello, nice to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Quickly plug your own newsletters first, because I read them and almost understand them.
So there's the Blind Spot, which is my general kind of overview of all sorts of things that everyone else might be missing, clues in the name. And I have now spun out my top tier element of that newsletter into its own, I call it sort of a pop-up, which is called The Peg. And that's specifically focused on stablecoins. And you can find it at thepeg.co.
I mean, I'm leaving a silence for people to fill in their own gaps. So backstory of Izabella and my friendship, we met at the Weekend of Mistakes, which is a really fun festival in Hay, kind of economics focused. Izabella, who doesn't like football in any way or know anything about it, came to a session where I was talking about the football finance, which was a really fun session. And anyway, as you do, we spent 3 hours on the train ride back. I think we fixed the entire media world, didn't we?
Yeah, exactly.
Like at least 90% of it, I would say.
With a flyby from some major economists at the same time. So
whilst we were going, well, you understand it because of your background. I was just sat there feeling really thick, but it's okay because we're both here now. Quickly, just tell us about your background in journalism, because you've worked in some fabulous places.
I'm getting old, so...
That's not what I meant.
It's extensive. So I actually got into journalism. I did, I don't know how conventional it is, but I did a master's in journalism specifically at what was then the London School of, not the London School, I'm going mad, London School of, College of Printing. It's been expired now, so it doesn't exist anymore. I think it's probably, or at least been bundled into the London.
Yeah, lots of these places are. There's like City St George's as well, isn't there? A lot of the UK journalism and media courses are sort of all coming together in a fight for survival.
Exactly. So out of that, gosh, it was such a competitive market. Mm-hmm. I ended up going abroad, spending some time on English language newspapers in Poland and Azerbaijan. Then,
as you do.
Part of my mission to understand how the world works and learn some Russian. At the time, that was not as controversial as it is now. And then I ended up working for a corporate magazine for BP. I was an editor of their internal magazine, but I really didn't like that, so I wanted to get back into proper journalism. And I somehow ended up on the Reuters trainee program, which was a great program. I mean, one of the best in the space at the time. Unfortunately, things didn't work out there. They had a downsizing. They narrowed the amount of trainees they had, and I ended up at long way around at CNBC. So I went from journalism to being a producer where I produced Squawk Box. That's where I really kind of got my teeth into markets.
Was this Andrew Ross Sorkin era Squawk Box? What are we talking about here?
This was the UK. So so CNBC had their own European venture. They also have Asia and America, and I worked in the European office in London. And I was producer of Squawk Box, associate. God, I can't even remember what the assistant producer, I think, in the end. Mm-hmm. And then I spent 3 years there, but it was incredibly stressful because you had to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning to do that show. It was it started at 6. So couldn't do it for much longer. And somehow I managed to wangle a job interview for FT Alphaville. This was in 2008. God, time flies. 2008.
So kind of we're talking here sort of original blogging era. And it was quite inventive, innovative. Alphaville for a major, you couldn't get more of a traditional publication than the salmon-paged FT, but they were prepared to let you guys loose on the internet.
It was absolutely crazy. I mean, I was a reader of FT Alphaville. I was a huge fan, and I was reading it every day at CNBC during the sort of walk up to to the financial crisis. I found it absolute essential reading. And what I loved about it was that it was so laissez-faire and, it was full of typos. It was like incredibly authentic. We were all grappling with like it was very hard to understand what was going on at that time. And I think what was nice about FD Alphaville from a third party perspective was that they were just so honest about not knowing these things. And that is in itself was really reassuring and readable, because you weren't being talked down on from a point of, superior understanding. It was like, we're all in this together trying to figure out what the hell was going on.
But because you were the FT, presumably you had access to kind of sources and people that no one else could dream of.
So that's what I imagined when I was on the outside.
Okay.
And then I managed to wangle my way in there. Paul did an interview with the editor, Paul Murphy, funny interview. Well, that's another story. And then ended up, as one of the core team. And I think the thing we all had in common was that we were incredibly geeky weirdos, probably now in hindsight, I'd realized we were all very neurodivergent. And yes, so one's assumption would be that we all had sources, and we did have sources, not to say we didn't, but we also, I think what really was the differentiating point of Alphaville was that we just had these geeky minds analyzing a lot of data. And it was very much like how I think the internet, sleuths or Reddit space, how OSINT works these days, right? But we went from like a team, historically, journalists would be in charge of a beat, and you might have team members in your particular beat, colleagues, but you usually are a sort of lone wolf, and you're operating, you're very kind of protective of your sources. It's very kind of
it's ultra competitive.
Ultra competitive internally, like everyone is.
And externally, because you want to beat everyone else on your beat.
Exactly. Whereas I think the difference with Alphaville was that we were immediately like a hive mind, and we were using Slack or whatever before it was Slack. I can't remember. I think it was from the beginning. Slack.
MSN Messenger.
Yeah. Or maybe I can't remember now. But anyway, I think it was, what was the blue one? Skype.
Nice.
That's what we were using.
May it rest in peace.
But that was, I think, the secret sauce. So we were collectively, working away, and no one else in the newsroom was operating in this way. And so we were sharing, and we were figuring things out as a sort of tribe, and this helped us be ahead of the curve. And they were incredibly internet savvy, and I thought I was internet savvy until I got to Alphaville, and I realized that I was just like 1,000 years behind them. And
it sounds like a fascinating experiment. Obviously, you then moved on to Politico. I'm trying not to make This Is Your Life, but I just love this story. Because I'm aware that you probably don't want to do This Is Your Life. But it is, first of all, I find the Alphaville time it's so interesting because it's so ahead of its time.
Yeah.
But also, I think, so relevant now.
Yeah.
And the same is true, I think, of your time at Politico.
Yeah, so I went from 13 years at the FT, and by, just to slightly address that period from a kind of reflective, This Is Your Life perspective, but very quickly, by the time I'd left, everything had changed, largely because the methods we were using had become far more popular. So we lost that sort of edge. And I think the signal got lost as well, because it's like back in the days when you had a BlackBerry, you were ahead of everyone, but by the time everyone had a BlackBerry, you didn't have the edge, right? So it had self-polluted the system, so it wasn't the signal it used to be. And I went to Politico, which is a much more conventional sort of operation, like completely, much more reporting focused than, say, analytical or big think kind of pieces that the FT does.
Ironically, more like a newspaper than what you were doing on a newspaper.
Ironically, yes, exactly. So I spent 3 years there trying to sort of kickstart their financial coverage. But in the end, that didn't work out for reasons. And I am now independent. Between those two, I had tried to go independent largely because I thought the future was sort of in the middle of, I think, at the point of my career, being quite ADHD, I just was starting to have a real issue with top-down structures. And as Alphaville got absorbed into the into the hierarchy of the newsroom and it stopped being the little autonomous republic that it used to be, I felt I really needed my freedoms. That's why I did that. And the Politico experiment was fantastic in the sense that I got to learn about a piece of the world that I had completely ignored for a long time, like how politics works, which was really, really insightful, I have to say. But I also just, politics is not my world. I find it very uncomfortable. So I am now back in my safe space, and my safe space is writing about stable coins and geeky kind of central bank
nerdy, geeky finance things,
and also kind of doing big sweepy trend pieces and sort of what I would call like the text version of like an Adam Curtis documentary. That's what I do.
And I'm so pleased you laid all this out, because it brings me to the sort of one of the many reasons I was so keen to have you on the show. And it's, as I say, really important you laid all that out in your experience, because the story you're telling about yourself and the ultimate decisions you've made and I've kind of made are that the importance of independence in journalism and how we all are looking at that. Every day, basically, I look at media websites, media news sites, and they're reporting someone else is culling XYZ number of jobs. And first of all, it's thoroughly depressing. Second of all, it only underlines the importance of independent work that is quote unquote proper journalism. Now, I watch all sorts of funny creators. I don't want to knock them. I look at creators who are doing analysis, if you like, of the news. And they have a role, absolutely, in our media environment. But there are some fundamentals of journalism that really matter, that those content creators, again, I don't want to say it disparagingly, because I do many of the things that they are doing. I produce my work in many of the, I'm posting stuff on TikTok, on Instagram, on YouTube, I'm, running an independent newsletter. So I don't want to disparage that. But some of that work of the fundamental type has to be done. And some of it is happening in newsrooms, a long way that continue. And some of that is happening independently. And it's something you and I think this was maybe our third cup of tea, we realised this on the train journey, we might have realised this is a true story. And for American listeners, I promise you this is true and a perfect summation of the UK. Izabella and I were sitting having a lovely chat and a cuppa. And then we get a message from the train, like driver, being like, I'm really sorry, guys. The train is stopping because there are people running around. There are like teenagers running on the track. So just bear with us. We're going to get off and have a word with them. This is a true story. Welcome to the UK in 2026. So it might have been this point when we realised that there also has to be, I hate sounding such a snob, but proper journalism done on independent alternative platforms.
Yeah.
And that does matter. And I know it's something you feel very passionate about at the brand you are running.
Yes, because without independent voices, I think signal gets lost. I see everything from the investor perspective, right? So independent signals are just very, very important. You can't afford to be swept up in groupthink because that's not how you make money. So if the group is right and you can just ride the trend, great, good for you. But if you want to outperform, you have to dispassionately analyze the news. And
so are you talking about as an independent journalist, that's not how you make money? Or are you talking about as an investor reading your work?
As an investor reading any news,
right,
like at all, right? And what I felt was that because of, I think there's just, since COVID, there's been this sort of, everything has got very politicized and very highly charged and very emotional. And
I mean, we're having this conversation 2 days after the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where, as everyone listening will know, it was charged by gunmen presumably trying to murder the president.
Yeah, exactly. So,
and if that doesn't prove polarization and highly charged political atmosphere, not much does.
Right. In the context of the media as well, like right there in the correspondence,
Absolutely
dinner.
Right.
So the markets, I felt, were not getting a dispassionate analysis, which is very important because if you just go with the flow and you don't play devil's advocate or you don't scrutinize and go, hang on, is this actually really in the case or whatever? then you will lose money. And it's a key rule in finance that you have to be emotionally removed from your positions, because if you're invested emotionally, you'll end up losing money potentially. So my view was that I couldn't do that anymore. There was too much of a sort of institutional, I wouldn't say it was a bias, but I would say an institutional sort of groupthink or pressure to frame things a certain way. The tolerance that...
And this is as a journalist.
This is as a journalist. And the tolerance that there used to be in the early days of Alphaville for like just exercising contrarian thinking just wasn't there anymore. It was very strange. And my theory was that actually this was all to do with how papers like the FT, which had always been very exclusive and focused on an elite audience, had, because of the nature of digital media, had to check. They've basically had to adapt around the medium, rather than stay true to what they used to be.
Explain that a bit more.
And the medium is the message kind of sense. So by that I mean you could say things in the FT but very plainly for most of the FT's history, because the people who read it had and it sounds very snobby, but I think it's true, like a sort of superior understanding of the financial statecraft, economic sort of reality facing everybody, and wouldn't necessarily get hysterical about things, just because
they wanted the cold hard facts.
They wanted just exactly.
You're reading it on your way into the city in the morning, and you want cold hard facts.
Yes, exactly. Colonel Jessup style. You can't handle the truth. Most papers, you can't handle the truth. This, like, the FT readership can handle the truth.
And has to handle the truth.
Yes, exactly. But digital media has changed this, because you have to market yourself. So you have to communicate, unless you go totally behind the paywall to the point that you become like nobody even knows you're out there. If you're not engaging, if you're not seeing, if there's no visibility of you, there's a problem. Besides, things leak anyway. So that when something leaks, it travels disproportionately, and it gets a circulation that can completely destroy your reputation. So I think my analysis was that it kind of led the FT down this very risk-averse path, and it just couldn't say those truths like it used to, or it had to frame them in very kind of fuzzy, euphemisms and ways to kind of package the reality so that it didn't get misinterpreted. So I felt that actually, if you wanted to speak bluntly to markets and exercise what might sometimes be seen as controversial opinions just for the sake of the mental exercise, you had to go behind a paywall, and you had to be kind of out of sight, out of mind, apart from like your select audience. There is a downside to that, obviously, because you then become an incredibly niche product. And of course, what has actually happened in reality is that the sort of, I think that sort of journalism has completely collapsed, and instead it's been replaced by what I would call independent analysts, who are now 10 a penny on Substack. So much so that I think Substack for a long time was wooing the kind of analyst, like the finance analysts.
You've been talking, the name that keeps springing to my mind is Doomberg, who totally behind a paywall, very, very high end, very expensive subscription cost. But the quality is kind of like the FT net was like, but exactly. With a voice. It does have a voice. The question that occurs to me through all of this, do you think more people should be jumping ship and becoming independent? Do you think there is a media world in which we have both things? That's the current world we are. Everyone's trying to work out the finances of it. Of course they are. But do you think...
So I would say...
How do you see it looking?
It's really tricky, because going independent...
Oh, it is.
As a journalist, I think there is a sort of romanticized version of the story where it's like, come to Substack, you'll be independent, you'll be free, you'll be able to control, you'll be your own paymaster. This is not true. You go to Substack, you actually end up, under the thumb of a specific audience. Very often a lot of journalists move at the point of peak popularity online, right? And they're known for X or Y. And then they go on Substack, and after a while, that story that they became known for peters out. People forget about. So they either start to lose subscriptions and then have to kind of adapt anyway, or conversely, they're known for X, and then if they change their position, they risk alienating the audience. So you end up captured by that.
Who are you thinking of?
I think over the COVID era, there were a lot of like people who jumped ship and did like a lot of free speech stuff or criticism of lockdowns and I
okay, that
think, for example, I think more specifically like China, like in the investment community, I think there was a time when everyone wanted to like have, I mean, it's come back in a way, but not for not because we're investing in China, but like China went through a big sort of peak, and so everybody was doing China stuff, and then as the news flow changes, like you've got to adapt, and people, or even on Alphaville, like we used to always say that a lot of the early day blogs started off doing M&A deals. That was the big thing at the time, and like Deal Breaker or Deal Book, like the name basically restricted themselves from adapting, whereas Alphaville was quite, ambiguous in the name, so we were much more open to adaptation. So I think that happens.
the question really then, I think that's most pertinent to both of us, and more importantly, the people listening to this show, is the direction of travel.
Hmm.
I guess this is a slight point where I want to bring up what the changes I've made at the edition, which is to drop the paywall. I redesigned the site. It's a bit more old school blog, actually, which listeners and readers know I'm very passionate about. Indeed, on the last episode of this podcast, I was talking to Rob Dunwood all about blogging in 2026. So go back and listen to that if you share my old school nostalgia for blogging. But it is about finding your route. Now, one of the reasons I dropped the paywall, as I wrote when I did so, was that there are only so many subscriptions any of us are willing/able to pay for.
Hmm.
And I guess in part that's why you have two different products, because they're aimed slightly at two different people. And I think it does make sense in our modern media era to have, what you've really done well, the Peg, which is a high-end, more expensive product, and the Blind Spot, which as you described is, highlighting things people may have missed, but you're sort of part of a community with that. You're getting information, but people don't pay for the Blind Spot, do they? But they're engaged with it in different ways.
So at the moment, so you're kind of front running my grand plan. So originally,
Okay, perfect. We'll do business therapy live on the show.
but I think this is like part of, I've had to iterate because I've had to learn as I go, and I've made mistakes. I'll be clear, like I've made mistakes, and my main mistake is that I launched on the advice of some analysts, really, that I should be quite, high level, very, I think my top package was like £50 a month, which is very high level for a journalist. And they would tell me, well, you kind of sit in this in between space between journalism and analysis. It's fair. That was a mistake. And the other mistake was that I had two tiers. So I had an entry level tier at £20 per month, and the whole package was £50. And all I did was agonize about not doing enough stuff for the £50 audience, which was supposed to be long form, big. And there was only, when we were expanding, I think it might just about have worked. But the reality is I was also trying to do too many things at the same time, and I burnt myself to.
Which is the classic entrepreneurial way of going about things.
Yeah, exactly. So what I've learned, but as you know, like unbundling or unwinding annual, once you've got subscriptions, unwinding them is really difficult, because as a journalist, you do not want to, you value the people who have invested in you, and you don't want to upset them, and you don't want to kind of say, well, look, I know you.
Or you misled anyone.
Yeah, and most of the time, like, you can't afford to pay them back. So you feel obliged to run the full annual subscription, right? And so there's this, economic uncertainty in terms of like how you can proceed without screwing over your existing customers who are your, biggest fans. So you feel a bond to them, right? So my idea was to unbundle the two tiers. That's why the Peg became the Peg, which I've just, for reasons of unbundling, is currently £10 a month. But this is because I call it a pop-up, and a sort of, what I'm calling it right now is a sort of what they call in the industry a minimum viable product. So I'm testing it out to see how useful it is, get people hooked. So I'm doing an extended run where it's £10 just to get people hooked. And then the aim is to then, elevate it to the price I need it to be to effectively cross-subsidize the Blind Spot. And the Blind Spot, at that point, the Blind Spot becomes free. So that will be like free reach. And then I don't feel any pressure. I'll write on it when I feel I have the inclination. And if I manage to make a lot of money from the high end product, then I can I can hire in the team that I want. I mean, in an ideal world, the peg becomes like the key cash flow and
Becomes the peg of your business.
Exactly.
But this all brings me on to another interesting point, and it's one I again had to grapple with, and I think lots of individual journalist creators are having to deal with. I think the sort of influencer style creator is not thinking about this because they know the whole model is brand deals and adverts, whether, AdSense and so on. For journalists, that's always felt a bit different. And one of the things we thought we could do by disappearing from normal newsrooms, quote unquote, and building our own independent things based on subscriptions is we wouldn't have to worry about advertisers. We wouldn't have to worry about the potential pressure that puts on us. And, you could, all that sort of the truth telling, unrestricted journalists would be possible.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is, as I say, there's only so many people that want to buy a subscription to any number of products. And that's not because they probably don't like your work. It's not that they don't want to back your work, but everyone has limits, and also, limits their amount to prepared on entertainment, which is what this would come into, and so on. And that brings us back to adverts, which is what I'm now building the edition around. I hope people are comfortable with that. And, I'm always conscious of who I am advertising. And similarly, well, first of all, I guess the question really is, do you agree with that, how I've characterised the difference between subscriptions and adverts?
I would agree. And I had a big, when I was considering what business model to do, I was very, I am on Substack now out of desperation, but I was not keen on the model. I didn't agree with the founder's vision that this was going to liberate journalists precisely because of this, but also because they didn't
precisely because you think there wouldn't be enough people willing to take out enough subscriptions.
Because of the fragmentation. It's like eventually there's just how many subscriptions can you afford? Like there has to either be a consolidation where there's a federation of independents who come together a bit like this is your realm, like in the old days when you had cable TV and you'd have the bundles, Sky Sports bundle, right? Well, we could have
I'm so proud of you,
like a journalistic version of that,
which people have talked about and has never really worked.
No, because then the issue is revenue sharing amongst the journalists. And the thing about journalists, as you know, it's like trying to herd cats, like the least collaborative people on the planet.
So does that mean actually we should get over our sort of, this is how I've come to think. We sort of have to get over our snobbiness about adverts.
I think so. And I also think we need to address the reality of what's happened with adverts, which is that everyone is because of the nature of digital media, everyone is competing over the same names on adverts mostly, which is like VP, like every other person is sponsored by a VPN as far as I can see. Right?
There'll be an affiliate link to NordVPN in the show notes. Have fun. Surf safely.
And that's also because I don't recommend VPNs, especially insert here. But it's because the nature of digital comms means that your audience is so scattered. It has to be something that sort of is likely to appeal to all sorts of people around the world, right? This is very different to how small publications used to be funded. If you looked at small publications, especially local papers or back in the day trade press, local press would be funded by the local Indian restaurant or the local cinema, that sort of thing, right? And there's this huge universe of small advertisers who've been completely, I think, pushed out of the advertising market because they have no platforms to advertise on because they can't really.
Or they just gave all their money to Meta, local.
Or they gave their money to Meta, right? And I think journalists would be smart to have some sort of local dynamic that could anchor and attract some of these local revenues. Or if you're trade press, you can then seek out specific things that appeal to that specific audience. So that's the advantage of, that's why I did the peg to some degree, is that then I have an anchor to a specific industry that appeals to certain advertisers because of the segmentation at hand.
Well, that kind of idea of riches in niches, as I often discuss. So you and I, as has been proven, could speak like this for hours and hours, and probably will do at other points. But I want to wrap this up with a question I often ask guests on this show, which is, if you and I are having this conversation in 1 year, 5 years, what is the media environment we're operating in going to look like? Because at the moment, it all feels very back to the future for me. Adverts, streamers, rebundling, etc., etc., etc. You know, the importance of live sport, all the stuff. How do you see this playing out?
I think that's, a very boring answer, but I kind of agree. And I also think the only other element is that I think there will be a local element. I think there has to be. I think journalism will have to kind of reroute around, it's the exact opposite of like the globalist trend, which like the FT is the perfect example of. It got so extended that it had to be everything to all people, and actually it missed the fact there's huge appetite locally for like just London stock news, right, or UK stock news, right? So I think the future of advertising or profitable business models will be like addressing regions like in some way or form. I think
And we started to see that with things like The Mill, The Londoner,
because
London-centric with Jim Water. There are those things popping up.
There are, unfortunately, I think there's still a disconnection between what's going on online and the physical space that they live in.
Okay.
So I think that's the third part of my kind of like answer to your question, is that I think events in those local regions, and whether it's like hosting like Good Morning, like bringing all your viewers to the docks of Liverpool, if that's where it used to be filmed, right? But I really wanted to do a local podcast in Ealing, where I live, because then I could big up all my local community establishments. I would love to have that element of it, whether that's adding a sort of restaurant review of Ealing or something, like cultural element. I don't know, but I think we've got to anchor it back in time and space in terms of regions.
Everything that I'm hearing from you, whether it's from adverts to local, is the power of community, and that I think is another thing that really is important to explore. As I say, I could talk about this with you, and will continue to talk about this with you for hours. Just before we go, remind people where they can see all your fantastic work.
So go to The Peg, which is thepeg.co, or go to my old website, which is theblindspot.com. But don't take a subscription out there, because I've migrated to Substacks. So just put in Mind the Blind Spot, because the Blind Spot was taken. I'm going to transfer the URL once I've killed the old site. But
fine.
For the time being, Mind the Blind Spot at Substack. Thank you.
Oh, I will absolutely link to all of that in the show notes. As I mentioned, the Edition newsletter is now free. So head over to theedition.net or newsletter.theedition.net, whack in your email address, get multiple newsletters a week about the crossover of culture, media and sport for free. If you run a business that would like to advertise on this glorious award-winning newsletter, please do get in touch, because I'd love to talk to you. As we've just discussed, we love advertisers. You can obviously listen to this podcast, and I'm at Charlotte A. Henry across social media. Izabella, this was such a joy. And listeners, thank you for listening, and I'll see you all next week.
Thank you.